Phil Spector told Jimi Hendrix that a single guitar couldn't create epic sound. What happened next changed how the most powerful producer in music understood power itself. December 1969, Beverly Hills. A private party at a mansion in the hills. One of those industry gatherings where the people who controlled popular music came to see and be seen. The house belonged to a record executive whose name appeared on gold records covering 3 walls of his living room. Maybe 40 people scattered through rooms that cost more than most musicians would earn in a lifetime. Phil Spector arrived fashionably late, wearing his signature dark sunglasses despite the evening hour. At 29, he was already a legend. The man who created the wall of sound. The producer who made records that didn't just play on radios, but commanded them. His technique of layering dozens of instruments and voices to create massive orchestral pop songs had revolutionized how music was made. When Phil Spector produced a record, it sounded like it came from heaven, played by a choir of angels backed by an orchestra of gods. The numbers spoke for themselves. Be My Baby by the Ronettes. You've Lost That Lovin' Feelin' by the Righteous Brothers. River Deep, Mountain High by Ike and Tina Turner. Each one a monument to his vision of what popular music could become. Phil didn't just produce songs, he constructed sonic cathedrals where every instrument had its place in a grand architectural plan. Tonight's party was familiar territory. Industry insiders who understood that Phil Spector wasn't just another producer, but an auteur, an artist whose canvas happened to be magnetic tape, and whose paint was every instrument he could fit into Gold Star Studios. The mansion itself reflected the success his wall of sound had created. Persian rugs, crystal chandeliers, original artwork on walls that cost more than most people's houses. He moved through the party with the confidence of someone who knew everyone wanted to talk to him. Record executives pitched projects. Songwriters hovered nearby, hoping for acknowledgement. Phil held court in the main living room, a glass of wine in one hand, gesturing with the other as he explained his latest recording session. The Righteous Brothers session last week, he was saying to a small circle of industry insiders. 32 musicians in the studio, 4 pianos, 8 violins, full horn section. That's how you create sound that moves people. That's how you build something that lasts. A songwriter leaned forward, genuinely curious. But doesn't all that instrumentation get muddy? How do you keep it clear? Phil smiled, enjoying the question. This was his expertise, his domain. That's the art of it. You don't keep it clear in the traditional sense. You create controlled chaos. Each instrument occupies its own frequency space, but they blend together to create something massive, like a wave hitting the beach. You don't hear each drop of water, but you feel the power of the whole ocean. He gestured with his wine glass, painting sonic pictures in the air. When I produced River Deep, Mountain High, we had 3 drummers, not playing the same part, but creating this wall of percussion that was bigger than any single drummer could achieve. That's what kids today don't understand. They think louder equals better. Volume without architecture is just noise. Someone mentioned that Jimi Hendrix was somewhere in the house. Phil nodded with polite disinterest. He'd heard the name, seen the headlines. Electric guitar virtuoso from Seattle, who'd conquered London, then come back to America as a star. Loud, flashy, popular with the kids and the rock press. But Phil dealt in something deeper than flash. He created art. He's talented, Phil said diplomatically, but it's all surface, volume and effects. Real music, music that touches souls, that requires orchestration. You can't create epic sound with just one instrument. You need layers. You need my wall of sound technique. The conversation continued, but Phil noticed someone had stopped moving in his peripheral vision. He turned slightly and saw Jimi Hendrix standing near the fireplace, holding an acoustic guitar. How long had he been there? Had he heard the comment? Jimi looked exactly like his pictures. The afro, the colorful clothes, the quiet intensity. But something about seeing him in person was different, smaller than expected, softer somehow. He wasn't commanding the room or demanding attention. He was just standing there, guitar in hand, like he was waiting for something. Jimi Hendrix, Phil said, loud enough for the room to hear. I was just talking about you. Jimi walked over, still carrying the acoustic guitar. Phil Spector, he said quietly. Honor to meet you. I've studied your records. Pet Sounds, those Beach Boys sessions. Incredible work. Phil felt a small surge of satisfaction. Even the rock stars knew who really created the sound that mattered. Thank you. That's what happens when you understand that music is architecture. You build it layer by layer. Foundation, structure, details. One instrument can't do that alone. No, Jimmy agreed. One instrument alone is limited. Phil relaxed. This would be easier than he'd expected. Exactly. Your electric guitar work is impressive. Don't misunderstand me. But to create something truly epic, something that fills sonic space completely, you need what I call the wall of sound. Multiple instruments, careful arrangement, professional orchestration. That's how you make records that change culture. Jimmy nodded thoughtfully. Makes sense. Mind if I try something? Phil gestured toward a corner of the room where someone had set up a small amplifier. Please. But Jimmy didn't move toward the amp. He sat down in a chair near the fireplace and adjusted the acoustic guitar on his lap. No amplifier, no effects, no wall of sound technique. Just a guitar and whatever came out of the wooden body. The room's conversations didn't stop immediately. People continued talking, laughing, networking. But some noticed that Jimi Hendrix was tuning an acoustic guitar, and they began to pay attention. Phil watched with curious interest. What could the electric guitar god possibly do with an acoustic instrument? Jimmy spent maybe 30 seconds tuning, adjusting each string until it was perfectly in tune with the others. His fingers moved quickly but carefully across the frets, checking intervals, making micro-adjustments. Phil noticed the precision. This wasn't casual tuning. This was someone who understood that perfect intonation was the foundation of everything that followed. Then Jimmy started playing. He didn't play one of his own songs. He didn't play a blues standard or a crowd-pleasing cover. He played something that sounded like it came from nowhere and everywhere at once. A melody that seemed both ancient and modern, both simple and impossibly complex. But it wasn't the melody that stopped conversation in the room. It was the sound itself. With just 6 strings and 10 fingers, Jimmy created what sounded like multiple instruments playing simultaneously. His thumb worked the bass notes, providing a rhythm section that was both steady and fluid. His fingers danced across the higher strings, creating melody lines that wove around each other like separate guitar parts. He used the guitar's natural resonance to create harmonic overtones that filled the spaces between the notes. Phil found himself leaning forward in his chair, trying to understand what he was hearing. This wasn't possible. You couldn't create that much sonic density with one acoustic guitar, but the sound was filling the room the way his wall of sound productions filled concert halls. Not through volume, but through complexity, through the way each note seemed to generate 3 or 4 other notes in its wake. Jimmy's left hand moved up and down the neck with fluid precision, finding chord voicings that shouldn't have been possible. He'd fret a note with his index finger while simultaneously using his pinky to create a harmonic 12 frets higher, generating bell-like tones that rang out over the main melody. His right hand was even more remarkable. Fingers working independently, each assigned to specific strings, creating a technique that was part classical, part flamenco, part something entirely his own. The guitar itself seemed to respond differently to his touch. Every slight variation in how he struck the strings created different timbres. A gentle touch produced whisper-soft notes that somehow still carried across the room. A more aggressive attack brought out percussive elements in the guitar's body, turning the instrument into its own rhythm section. Phil noticed that people around the room had unconsciously moved closer to where Jimmy was playing. The acoustics of the living room, designed for conversation, somehow perfectly suited what Jimmy was creating. The hardwood floors and high ceilings added natural reverb that enhanced rather than clouded the guitar's voice. Jimmy played rhythm and lead simultaneously, making the guitar sound like a small orchestra. He found harmonic sweet spots on the neck where fretted notes combined with open strings to create natural reverb effects. His right-hand technique was unlike anything Phil had seen, fingers picking individual strings while the thumb provided percussive hits against the body of the guitar, adding drum-like elements to the arrangement. The room had gone completely quiet. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. People set down drinks and turned to watch. This wasn't just skillful guitar playing. This was something else entirely. This was one person with one instrument creating the kind of sonic architecture that Phil spent weeks building in studios with dozens of musicians. Phil felt something uncomfortable in his chest. Confusion, maybe, or recognition of something he didn't want to recognize. Jimi played for maybe 3 minutes. No showmanship, no visual tricks. He sat in that chair with his eyes mostly closed, completely absorbed in the music, unaware of the effect he was having on everyone around him. The acoustic guitar seemed to expand in his hands, becoming bigger than itself, filling sonic space that shouldn't have been fillable by one instrument. When he finished, there was a moment of complete silence. Not the awkward silence that sometimes followed performances, but the kind of silence that happens when something profound has just occurred and nobody wants to be the first to break the spell. Then someone started clapping, and suddenly everyone was applauding. Not enthusiastic rock concert applause, but the respectful, almost reverent applause that happens when musicians recognize mastery. Jimi set the guitar aside and looked at Phil. "That work for you?" Phil didn't answer immediately. He was processing what he just heard, trying to reconcile it with everything he believed about music production, about sonic architecture, about the wall of sound technique that had made him famous. "How?" Phil finally asked. "How what? How did you make one guitar sound like that?" Jimi looked genuinely puzzled by the question. "I just played it." "No," Phil insisted. "I've been making records for 15 years. I know what one instrument can and can't do. What you just played, that required multiple parts, multiple layers. That was orchestral." Jimi smiled softly. "Maybe the orchestra was already there, in the guitar. I just had to find it." Phil felt the ground shifting beneath his understanding of music. His wall of sound technique was based on the premise that you needed multiple instruments to create epic sound. Layer upon layer of carefully arranged parts, mixed together to create something bigger than the sum of its parts. But Jimi had just created that same bigness, that same epic feeling, with one acoustic guitar. "That's not possible," Phil said quietly. "What's not possible?" "Creating that much sound with one instrument. I've spent my career proving that you need orchestration, arrangement, multiple parts. The wall of sound exists because one instrument isn't enough." Jimi looked at him with something like sympathy. "Maybe it's not about how many instruments you use. Maybe it's about how deeply you understand the one you have." The conversation that followed was awkward. Phil tried to maintain his position, explaining his production techniques, his approach to sonic architecture. But something fundamental had shifted in his confidence. He'd built his career on the idea that musical power came from addition, from layering more and more elements until you created something massive and overwhelming. Jimi had just shown him musical power that came from subtraction, from finding infinite possibilities within finite resources. "I understand your wall of sound approach," Jimi said gently. "Those Ronettes records, they're incredible. But maybe there are different ways to fill space. Your way uses multiplication, many instruments creating bigness. What I was playing uses, I guess you'd call it division, taking one instrument and finding all the instruments hidden inside it." Phil felt disoriented, like someone had rearranged furniture in his house while he was sleeping. Everything looked familiar, but nothing was where it should be. "But the mathematics don't work," he insisted. "Sound is physics. Frequency, amplitude, harmonic content. One instrument has physical limitations." "Does it?" Jimi asked. "Or do we just tell ourselves it does because we haven't explored deeply enough?" The question hung in the air between them. Phil had spent 15 years in recording studios, working with the best musicians in the world, perfecting techniques that had become industry standards. He'd won awards, influenced countless other producers, created a signature sound that was instantly recognizable across radio and television. But in 3 minutes with one acoustic guitar, this quiet young man had made him question the fundamental assumptions underlying everything he'd achieved. Other people at the party came over to talk to Jimi about what he'd played. Phil found himself standing alone, processing what had happened. A record executive approached and tried to engage him in conversation about upcoming projects, but Phil barely responded. His mind was replaying those 3 minutes, trying to understand how one person with one guitar had created something that challenged everything he thought he knew about making music. The worst part wasn't that Jimi had played beautifully. Phil had heard beautiful guitar playing before. The worst part was that Jimmy had achieved something Phil had been trying to achieve his entire career. That sense of epic, overwhelming sound that transported listeners to another world. And he'd done it with the exact opposite approach. Where Phil built up, Jimmy stripped down. Where Phil added layers, Jimmy found depths. Later that evening, as the party wound down, Phil approached Jimmy one more time. "Would you be interested in recording?" Phil asked. "I mean, working together, in a studio." Jimmy looked surprised. "I appreciate that, but I'm pretty committed to my current setup, Electric Ladyland and all that." "I could arrange something different," Phil continued. "We could experiment with acoustic arrangements, see what happens when we combine your approach with studio production." Jimmy smiled politely. "That's kind, but I think we might be trying to solve different problems." Phil nodded, understanding that he'd been politely declined. But more than that, understanding that the decline came from someone who didn't see what Phil did as necessary or even relevant. In the weeks following that party, Phil found himself thinking constantly about what he'd witnessed. He'd built the wall of sound technique because he believed popular music needed to be bigger, more epic, more emotionally overwhelming than what single instruments could provide. His productions were architectural achievements, carefully constructed monuments to sound. But Jimmy had shown him that epic sound might not require construction at all. It might require discovery, finding what was already there, hidden in the resonance of wood and steel strings, waiting for the right touch to bring it into existence. Phil's work routine, usually methodical and confident, began showing signs of uncertainty. In the studio, he found himself listening differently. When the orchestra arrived for a session, instead of immediately diving into arrangements, he'd ask individual musicians to play alone first. What could one violin reveal before it became part of the string section? What secrets were hiding in a single piano before it was joined by three others? His longtime collaborator and engineer, Larry Levine, noticed the change. "Phil seemed to be questioning everything," Larry later recalled in interviews. He'd stop sessions and ask musicians to play softer, to leave more space. He was still building the wall of sound, but now he wanted to understand what each brick contributed before cementing it into place. The Crystals were recording Dadu Ron Ron around this time. Normally, Phil would have orchestrated a full arrangement immediately. Drums, bass, multiple guitars, horns, strings, the works. Instead, he spent an entire day just with the singer and a single piano, exploring the song's melodic core. Only after he understood what the song was trying to say, at its most basic level, did he begin adding other instruments. Phil continued making records using his wall of sound technique. But something had changed in his approach. He began listening for the spaces between instruments rather than just adding more instruments to fill those spaces. He started asking different questions about what made music powerful. In a 1973 interview with Rolling Stone, 3 years after Jimmy's death, Phil was asked about influences on his production style. "There was a night in Beverly Hills," Phil said slowly. "Jimi Hendrix played acoustic guitar at a party. 3 minutes, maybe 4. He did something I'd been trying to do with 30 musicians and weeks of studio time. He found the orchestra that was already in the instrument." The interviewer pressed for details. "Did it change how you approach production?" Phil was quiet for a long moment. "I spent my career believing that epic sound required building something massive, layer by layer. The wall of sound was about addition, accumulation, more instruments, more voices, more everything. Then I watched Jimmy find infinite depth in 6 strings. It made me realize I might have been thinking about power all wrong." "How so?" "Real power might not come from adding more. It might come from understanding more deeply what you already have." The interviewer asked if Phil had ever tried to recreate what he'd heard that night. "No," Phil admitted. "What Jimmy did couldn't be recreated. It could only be discovered. And it could only be discovered by someone who understood the guitar the way he did. I understood studios, arrangements, production techniques. He understood music itself." Years later, when musicians asked Phil for advice about creating powerful recordings, he would sometimes tell them about that December night in Beverly Hills. "Find someone who can do with one instrument what you think requires 10, he'd say. "Watch them carefully. Then ask yourself if you're trying to build power or find power. There's a difference, and it matters more than you think." The story of that evening became legendary among session musicians who worked with Phil in the 1970s. They noticed that his later productions, while still orchestral and layered, had more space in them, more attention to what individual instruments could contribute rather than just how many instruments could be added. Sonny Bono, who'd worked closely with Phil in the early days, observed the change during a 1974 recording session. Phil had always been about more instruments, more voices, more everything. But after that night with Jimmy, he started talking about depth instead of width. Same wall of sound, but now he was interested in how deep each layer went, not just how many layers he could stack. The influence rippled outward through the industry. Producers who learned from Phil began incorporating his new approach. Instead of automatically reaching for full orchestration, they'd start with single instruments and add only what the song demanded. The wall of sound technique evolved from pure addition to thoughtful construction. Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys, who had always been influenced by Phil's work, noticed the change when they collaborated on later projects. Phil's arrangements became more sophisticated, Wilson recalled. Not more complex, but more sophisticated, like he'd learned the difference between impressive and profound. Phil Spector told Jimi Hendrix that epic sound required orchestration, required the wall of sound technique that had made Phil famous. Jimmy responded by showing him that epic sound might have been hiding in plain sight all along, waiting for someone who understood how to find it rather than build it. The encounter didn't change Phil's career dramatically. He continued making records that sounded like Phil Spector productions. But it changed how he listened to music, how he thought about power, and how he understood the relationship between complexity and depth. Musicians who worked with both Phil and Jimmy noticed the fundamental difference in their approaches. Phil was an architect, said session guitarist Glenn Campbell, who played on recordings for both producers. He designed sound from the ground up, blueprint to finished building. Jimmy was more like an archaeologist. He dug into instruments and found sounds that were already there, waiting to be discovered. The irony wasn't lost on industry insiders who knew both men. Phil Spector, the producer famous for massive orchestral arrangements, had been humbled by a guitarist playing solo acoustic. But rather than destroying his confidence, the encounter had refined it, taught him that even his signature technique had room for deeper understanding. Jimmy didn't prove me wrong, Phil reflected in one of his last interviews. He showed me I was asking the wrong questions. I was asking how to make one guitar sound like 30 instruments. He was asking how to find the 30 instruments that were already in one guitar. Better question, better answer.